Hello again, Math 10 students. In this video, we're going to continue our work with factoring. That's section 7.7 in the book. And I'm going to assume you've either already watched the first video in the series, or you're pretty comfortable with factoring quadratics or trinomials, and you just want to deal with some of the more complicated cases that involve negatives. If you haven't watched the first video and you don't really know much about factoring, I'm going to encourage you to stop this one and go back and watch the part 1 of factoring. Alright, let's take a look at what happens when you're factoring a polynomial, a quadratic is really the better term for them, and you have a negative product. Again, if you don't know what I mean when I say the product and the sum, go back and watch the first video first and that'll help illuminate that. So let's factor this particular polynomial. You'll notice that the product is negative. The product is always that number that's on its own at the end that is not the coefficient of x. And it's negative here, right? So there's a negative product. What do we do if the product is negative? Well, how could I possibly get a negative product? How could I multiply two things together to get a negative answer? Can't be a positive times a positive. It's going to have to be a positive times a negative or a negative times a positive. That means the two factors are going to have different signs. Well, this has some implications down the road too, because for that sum, when I'm adding together two things that have different signs, I actually have to subtract their values. So that means we're actually going to think about subtracting the values to get the sum here. So let's go ahead and try this one out. Again, I always encourage you to very first step is identify your product and sum. So I need two numbers that multiply together, and I'll abbreviate multiply. I'm just going to write mult to negative 24. And because it's negative, I'm actually going to write down here subtract. I need two things to also subtract to that 10. Now technically I'm still adding them and one of them is just negative, but I find that it helps to write out subtract here so that I remember I'm subtracting the values. And from here on out I can ignore the negative signs until the very end. What I'm doing here is I'm compartmentalizing things. I'm making it so that I don't have to care about the signs anymore as long as I understand these two things. I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to 24 and subtract to 10. I know it's a negative 24, but I can ignore the negative sign for right now and just think, how can I get 24? Well, we've done this before. 1 times 24, 2 times 12, 3 times 8, 4 times 6, and that's all the different ways I can get it. 5 doesn't go into 24, and 6 is already on my list. So in the last video, we saw 4 and 6 worked out, but that's because the values had to add up to 10. If I subtract 4 and 6, I get 2, so that doesn't work. And actually, the pair that's going to work for me this time is the 12 and the 2. When I subtract 12 and 2, I get 10. Now, when you're subtracting, it matters which one's negative and which one's positive. In other words, if I did 2 minus 12, like that, that would be negative 10. And that's not what I want. I want them to subtract to a positive 10, because that's my sum. So I'm actually going to write it as 12 minus 2 to get a positive 10. That means my two factors are 12 and negative 2. You can put a plus sign in front of that 12 here. You don't necessarily have to write out both iterations of this as long as you remember one of them's positive and one of them's negative, and they have to end up combining to give me, because this sum is positive, a positive 10. And just think through which pair of signs is going to do that for you. Remember, they're going to have different signs, so basically the larger number is going to keep the sign of the sum here. So when I write this in parentheses, always starting with x, I'm going to write my two factors, and they're plus 12 and minus 2. And remember, it does not matter what order you put these in. You could have had the x minus 2 first and the x plus 12 last, and that would be perfectly okay. So if the product is negative, you're going to subtract the values to get the sum, and you're going to have two different signs in your factors. One will be positive, one will be negative. These signs here do not have to mirror the signs up here at all. It's not positive and negative because the first two were. I could have had, again, x minus 2 first and x plus 12. It's the fact that they're different signs is only to do with the fact that this thing is negative. That second number being negative, that product being negative, is what determines the fact that I have two different signs. And to decide which one's positive and which one's negative, again, just try both cases out is really the easiest way to do it until you develop an intuition for it. Try both cases out and see which one, when you put them together and subtract them, gives you the positive 10 that you want for your sum. Another way to think about it, though, is that the sum, whatever the sign with the sum is going to go with the larger of the two factors. Let's take a look at a couple more examples that are not necessarily trickier, but involve some of the tricks that we've seen. All right, let's factor this guy. Now remember, the first thing that I always have you do is tell me what the product and sum are. So we need to do two things that multiply to, well, it's always the constant term, the number that doesn't have an x. So they're going to multiply to negative 20. And uh-oh, I don't have a sum, right? Where's the number? You've seen this trick before. If you don't see a coefficient, go ahead and slide a 1 in there. Because my product is negative, I'm going to think about subtracting to get that sum. And they're going to subtract to negative 1. Now, remember, from here on out, you can totally ignore the signs. All I want you to do now is hit pause and try to find two numbers that multiply up to 20 and subtract to 1. See if you can find those two numbers. Don't even worry about the signs, and then we'll deal with the signs at the end. All right, did you find two numbers? A lot of ways to get 20. You could have done 1 times 20, 2 times 10. 3 doesn't go into 20, but 4 does. 4 times 5. And if I try to write 5, it's already on my list, so I don't have to write it again. Those are all the ways that you can get 20. Now, when I subtract them, 20 minus 1 is 19, 10 minus 2 is 8, but 5 minus 4 is 1. Again, I need to think about the order things go in, so if it's 4 minus 5, or if it's 5 minus 4, well, always keep the sign of the bigger number, so 4 minus 5 actually will give me the negative 1 that I want. So I'm just thinking through which one is negative and which one is positive at the very end this way. 4 will have to be positive and 5 will have to be negative to get me that negative 1. And I'll just write my answer in two split parentheses like this. Each one starts with an x, and you have to have a sign after the x. It's going to be plus 4 and minus 5. So the 4 is positive, the 5 is negative. Let's take a look at another weird example. Let's factor this thing, x squared minus 9. Even weirder than the previous thing. Okay, so my two factors are going to multiply up to, always the constant term, the term not touching x, so multiply to negative 9. And they're going to have to, since that's negative, subtract. But what are we subtracting to? There's not even an x in there, so I can't put in that little 1. Well, you can think what's really going on here is that this is kind of like 0x. The x term is missing completely, not even there, so you can't put a 1 in front of it. That means it's 0. So I need them to subtract to 0. All right, so 9, how can I get 9? Well, it's either 1 times 9 or 3 times 3. Don't worry about the 0 yet. The 0 throws people off. 0 is weird. I know. 0 makes us uncomfortable, but just don't worry about it. Factor your 9 and think, how can I get 9? Well, 9 minus 1 is 8. Oh, well, look at that. 3 minus 3 actually is 0. All right, and then you don't really have to worry about which one's positive and which one's negative here. They're both the same, right? So it's going to be in your parentheses. As long as one of them's positive and one of them's negative, it doesn't matter which is which. So you could have x plus 3 times x minus 3. So even though 0 is a bit weird, still works out. All right, one last example. We talked a lot about what to do if you have a negative product. Things can get weird if you have a positive product as well, if the sum is negative. We, in the first video, saw all examples that were completely positive, so positive product. And if the product is positive, you might well imagine, it's going to be the same sign. The only way you can multiply two things together to get a positive is if you have a positive times a positive, or a negative times a negative. Either of those will give you a positive answer. In the first video, all of our examples were positive times positive, but negative times negative is also positive. Either way, same sign means you're going to add the values to get the sum. So let's try this one out. We need two factors that multiply to, again, that number that is on its own, not touching x, so 21. And since it's a positive 21, I'm thinking that I need to add the values to get my sum of negative 10. All right, So again, in this phase of the process, don't even think about your signs. Just don't even ignore them. All I'm doing is looking for two numbers that multiply to give me 21 and add up to 10. Well, 21 could be 1 times 21. 2 doesn't go in there. 3 does. 3 times 7. And there's really no other way to factor 21. Either of those pairs of numbers add up to 10? Sure. 3 and 7, right? 3 plus 7 gives me 10. Now the problem, of course, is that that's positive 10 and I want a negative 10. So I just look at my options. It's either positive times a positive, or it could be a negative times a negative. Well, in that case, it would be negative 3 minus 7, same sign, so I add, and I get negative 10, which is what I was after. So it's going to be negative 3 and negative 7 for this one. And I'm going to split this into x minus 3 and x minus 7, just like that. And I have it factored. So to summarize, when you're dealing with positive and negative signs in factoring, always look at the sign of the product first. The product is always the term that's not touching x. If that product is positive, you're going to be adding the values to get the sum, and if it's negative, you're going to be subtracting the values to get the sum. And you can ignore the signs for the next step. Just think, hey, if I write down my product and sum, I know what I'm multiplying to. I know if I'm adding or subtracting and what my goal is. You should be able to find the two values, the two numbers, and then worry about the signs at the end. Again, if the product is positive, you're going to have different signs. If it's if it's a negative product, you're going to have different signs, and if it's a positive product, you're going to have the same sign. To figure out which sign is which for a negative product, just write out both possibilities and see which one gets you the sum that you're after.